Today, we have a lot of interesting stuff coming your way. It's all about progressive reformers and how they regulated the economy back in the early 1900s.
In the early 1900s, the United States economy was straying away from a more agricultural and rural economy to one that was more urban and industrialized. The economy was growing rapidly, and it was run by a small number of large companies. For example, in 1906, a mere 7 men controlled 85% of the U.S. railroads. Corporations began to organize trusts, which is where business joined together to hold stock and control their sector of the economy. These trusts were normally free of government interference, and they were able to dictate the lives of their many workers.
The owners of these trusts did not care much for their workers and forced them to work long hours and receive extremely low wages. Theodore Roosevelt witnessed these injustices and proposed major regulations for these trusts, such as the Meat Inspection Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the Hepburn Act. While these acts and commissions put the trusts at check, it did not affect the economy as much as the work of Woodrow Wilson. Once Woodrow Wilson came into office, he constructed an all-out assault on the triple wall of privilege. This was the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. In order to tackle the tariff, Wilson created the Underwood Tariff. To tackle the banks, he created the Federal Reserve Act. And to tackle the trusts, he created the Federal Trade Commission.
Tonight we have a lot of interesting stuff lined up for you. Stay tuned to find out everything you need to know about the economic reform from the early 900s.
So today, we have a very lucky chance to interview Louis D. Brandeis today. So, Mr. Brandeis, you grew up in Kentucky during the Civil War, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you graduated at Harvard at the age of 20, and it's rumored that you have the highest average GPA in the school's history. Now, is that true?
No comment.
So from 1878 to 1916, you worked in various law practices. Once as the law clerk for the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. In 1916, you became the Associate Justice on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I was actually nominated by Woodrow Wilson.
And so you also wrote a very influential book titled Other People's Money and How Bankers Use It. So this shined a light on how the banks handle our money, and it also described the ways to take them down.
Yeah, the point of this book was to inform the general public on important issues regarding their money and how it was handled.
Yeah, well, you have a very impressive resume, Mr. Brandeis. So thank you for doing this interview with us.
No problem. During the hiatus of the movement, Woodrow Wilson imposed much legislation in order to improve the current economy, such as the Underwood Tariff, the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, and the Clayton Antitrust Act.
Each of these reforms had great effects on the workings of our economy. For example, the Underwood Tariff greatly reduced the rates of import taxes, giving countries more incentive to trade with the U.S. The Federal Reserve Act was created to centralize the banking system, cutting the regional reserves to only 12, which are spread across the country and controlled via the executive branch. The addition of the Federal Reserve Act made the country's banking system much more streamlined.
Another successful reform would be the Federal Trade Commission Act. In order to control poor trade practices, Woodrow Wilson believed a commission should be implemented to fight monopolies within the economy. Last but not least, the Clayton Antitrust Act, which added to the Sherman Antitrust Act by recognizing poor business practices such as exclusive sales, mergers within which reduce competition, and cutting of prices in order to run competitors out of money.
To summarize, Woodrow Wilson changed our economy for the better. Without these acts, businesses could run rampant, practicing regressive economic behavior and therefore undermining our economy. This movement for a better economy led to much needed reform, and luckily Woodrow Wilson was there to help create the modern systems which we still use to this day.
Today, we have a really special interview with the former President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Thank you for coming to us for this interview.
No problem. Thank you for inviting me.
So your presidency was a very busy one. You were president during World War I and a movement of the Progressive Reform.
Yeah, it was busy, but I wanted to make sure that my name was in the history books.
Well, it definitely is. You led us to victory over the Germans in Europe and led reform that changed our economy for the better of the people and the country. Some of these pieces of reform being the Federal Reserve Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act.
I tried to leave a lasting, beneficial change to the economy that would still help even after my presidency.
It definitely will continue to be a great improvement even after our lifetimes. You graduated from Princeton and are the only president to earn a doctorate degree. How did this help you during your presidency?
Well, through both Princeton and Johns Hopkins, I learned the importance of hard work. They also helped me problem solve in some of the toughest situations during my presidency.
Well, sir, it has been a huge honor to interview you. Thank you again for coming.
No problem. Today, we have a really exciting guest for you. William Howarth, a very successful entrepreneur, has arrived on the show to give us some insight on how he feels about the way that the government interfered with major companies during the early 1900s. So, Mr. Howarth, what exactly are your views on this topic?
To be quite honest with you, I thought it was horrible. I feel like the richest and most powerful people should stay on top, and the rest should try to work just as hard as they did to get in that position. I feel that Woodrow Wilson was in no place to place such restrictions on them and dictate the fate of those companies, as they could have expanded to a point where the owners would have complete control of their particular industry. If it weren't for Wilson, we could have some very powerful businesses, which today could have a very strong influence on not only the US economy, but also the global economy. If these businesses were able to become coercive monopolies, we could be at a very different position. Whether that position is a good or bad one depends on your perspective. I, for one, think that having few companies run everything is great, while others feel it is wrong due to the fact that they want everyone to have an opportunity to become successful. Everything that occurred in the early 1900s was a mistake, and I feel that things like the Federal Trade Commission Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act weren't beneficial to the US at all. If we had allowed those trusts to grow even larger, our country would be able to run on a more economic level rather than a political one. I know that if I grow my companies to a point where they're able to eliminate all other competition, I would not want the government to interfere and put all sorts of restrictions on what I can and cannot do.
While Wilson was giving his all to revive the U.S. economy, World War I broke out, causing much panic within the United States. Wilson shifted his focus from the United States to the international stage. This hindered his efforts and limited the movement.
After World War I came the Great Depression. Though the economic reform aided pre-war economy, it led to the Great Depression due to the stock market crash in 1929. This occurred due to distrust in the American economy. In this instance, the economic reform that Wilson had imposed failed the economy. The limitations that they faced were minimal. Sure, a couple of the laws weren't able to be passed, but overall, the movement was unstoppable, and Wilson was determined to complete his tasks. As you can see, a lot of important reform happened in the economy back in the 1900s that shaped the way our country is today. It took a lot of work from President Wilson to fix our economy from the state that it was in during the beginning of the 20th century. But overall, the main things that you should take away from this segment are the steps that Wilson took to improve the economy, which were the Underwood Tariff, the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, and the Clayton Antitrust Act. While these did not run completely smoothly at first, they shaped the way that things were run in the country after the Second World War. I'm Rehan Yadav, and you're watching the news.